So, good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange, in which we'll explore how we can improve our own well-being, how we can better contribute to the well-being of our stakeholders through the activities of our organizations, and how we might take steps collectively to ensure a greater level of well-being across society more broadly, with our special guest, Mark Fabian. Mark has been described as one of the most exhilarating thinkers working on well-being today. He is an associate fellow at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and an associate professor at the University of Warwick. And his current research focus is on how we might reimagine the welfare state as a well-being state to better contend with the nature of the challenges that we currently face. His first solo book was published by Oxford University Press in 2022 and is called A Theory of Subjective Wellbeing. And his first book for a mass audience was published earlier this year by Bedford Square. It's called Beyond Happy: How to Rethink Happiness and Find Fulfilment. And it was described as essential reading by none other than Manda Scott, a former MarketingKind exchange guest. And I would argue that that might be especially true for us, because marketing is the function in an organization that brings a human understanding of the world inside the enterprise, and can be used to direct the activities of an enterprise towards creating the right benefits for its stakeholders. So arguably, a deeper understanding of well-being could play an even more transformative role in changing how we work than has already been played, for example, by the behavioral sciences and advances in behavior change in recent years, moving us on from simply a focus on how we can better influence people to adopt the choices and behaviors that we'd like them to a more profound exploration of the kind of choices and behaviors that it would be in people's best interests for us to be promoting in the first place. Of course, today's exchange also builds on our conversation last month with Tim Jackson on how we might build an economy around care as its organizing principle, and many of our previous exchanges as well. Welcome to MarketingKind, Mark. What order of well-being are you enjoying today?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm doing quite well today. I think I've just come back from a walk as well, so I'm generally in a like calm and chill mood, which is always nice. And teaching is finished, marking is finished. I'm transitioning into the more self-directed part of the year, so that's also lovely.
Well, it's good to be part of that liminal space with you.
Hmm.
Mark, let's turn first of all to exploring your most recent book. When I first looked at it, and before I'd read the book, just the title Beyond Happy made me think first of Emma Bovary from Flaubert's Madame Bovary,
Oh, yeah.
who had an idea of happiness. And happiness was always just around the corner. And because she was constantly pursuing some kind of material satisfaction that would finally make her happy, she was never able to actually enjoy the happiness in front of her, and that led
Mhm.
to her downfall. But more importantly, what did you mean by the title of the book, and why did you write it?
Well, I love to kick off with a literary reference, and that's very appropriate because that is exactly what I meant. So, chapter one of the book is about the hedonic treadmill, which some of you may be familiar with, which I think is a good place to start a discussion of happiness and well-being. It's basically, as you just described, that this sense that happiness is just around the corner, just over the next material horizon or the next technological horizon, whatever it might be. And if I just get to that horizon, I'll be happy, and then I'll be tranquilized, at peace, and I can just stop and enjoy life. I'll be satisfied. I won't need anything else. And as described in Madame Bovary, that doesn't quite work out most of the time. My favorite example that I came across recently is I was at Chambord Palace in France a couple of months ago, and there's a portrait there of the former Queen of Poland who used to live in this like incredibly decadent palace. And she mentions in this little blurb from her diary how much she loves it there. And, if she could just take Chambord and put it in Alsace, she would be at my center, is what she says. So, like, it's not enough to have the biggest palace in Europe at any one particular time. You also need to have it in a particular part of Europe, then you'll be fine. So, I think this kind of drives home the point that uh, kind of acquisitiveness is unlikely to lead to a sense of well-being. And then the first chapter of the book kind of canvasses some responses that we might have. So I think materialism encourages us to lean into that psychological dynamic, and that's not very helpful.
Mm.
Buddhism encourages us to get off the treadmill. And I think in its most extreme forms, it's kind of about totally ridding ourselves of ego and self and desire and these kind of things. That might be appropriate for some people. It does seem to work for some people. I think we could all do with a little dose of Buddhism, particularly in kind of contemporary materialist cultures. But what I argue in the book is that we should try to make the treadmill a place we want to be. And that then sets up the rest of the book. So the way that we make the treadmill a place we want to be is to think about organizing our lives or designing our lives in a way that our lives generate pleasant, fulfilling, and valuable experiences and engagements for us while staying kind of dynamic. And so we want to kind of keep living our life in that particular way.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that there are elements of Buddhism that can go far. And if we think of the advice to simply step off the treadmill, then one way to interpret it is as life advice. And obviously, that's not for everyone because it leads to the life of a recluse. Another way to interpret it is to step off the treadmill temporarily during a meditation or something, which of
Mm.
course could be used to then reinvigorate and renew other dimensions of life. Now, you specifically orchestrate the book around living a life that is more pleasant, more fulfilling, and more valuable. And
Mhm.
those seem like sort of unarguably good things. But why specifically those three good things? Because there are so many positive qualities that we might like life to have.
So I think this was mostly a kind of rhetorical device to use those words as a way to organize three parts of the book. Um, it's just helpful organization. So the first part of the book is about methods of mood management in particular, and how to get started living an examined life, which I think part of the reason why we often end up in these kind of hedonic treadmill traps is that we're not really thinking about what we're doing. In particular, that certainly I think when we're very young, we tend to think about how to get money or how to get time. So there's this like the FIRE community, financial independence, retire early, instead of thinking about what it is that we want these things for. And so I think FIRE is kind of a bit missing the point because you get to your financially independent early retirement and then you think, well, what am I going to do with all this time and money? Whereas I think if you just thought about that first, you might find a way to just make that your life and you'll just be doing it for your whole life and you won't want to retire early because you'd then be retiring from the things that bring you meaning and fulfillment and pleasant experiences. I also talk a bit about character traits in the first part of the book, particularly integrity, which comes back later. The second part of the book is really about self-actualization. So it's like once you've decided that you want to kind of be a values-led person or you need to figure out how it is that you want to live, what's the kind of process that you can go through to do that? So I think self-actualization gets talked about a lot in the Western psychotherapeutic tradition, but it's usually presented as a kind of narrative thing that you go through in chatting with someone. I try to provide a bit more of a step-by-step guide to how you do it, bringing together a whole bunch of different theories from psychology, self-determination theory, self-discrepancy theory, self-verification theory. A lot of these are from the psychology of self, understandably. So anyway, hopefully that's an interesting book, and I particularly wrote that for young people. So when I was younger and trying to figure out what to do, I was really looking for something like that, and so I hope that that book helps teenage people. Very first draft of this book, back when I was 25 or something, was called "Making the Life Most of Your Quarter Life Crisis," and chapter four is really directed at that. And then the third part of the book is about nihilism, and about how we kind of rescue meaning from the postmodern morass that we're in without going back to fairly oppressive regimes, which is what I think characterized a lot of earlier cultural forms of organization.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the valuable experiences are the ones that get us out of nihilism. The fulfilling ones are the ones where we feel like we're expressing ourselves and we're engaged in activities with other people that are worth doing. And the pleasant experiences are the ones where our emotions are really live. Yeah,
Let's take a brief moment before we move on to other things, but let's take a brief moment to explore each of those three
sure.
parts. I mean, in a sense, the book gets even more and more interesting as it goes on, but I wouldn't want to disparage making life pleasant. For a lot of people, for example, in a materially successful career where they're not sure if it's aligned with, the public interest, they might crave greater meaning. But for a
Hmm.
lot of people, for example, in our community who might be working on things that have a lot of purpose to them, actually can be a risk of burnout, and actually
Mm.
making life pleasant can be an important part of life. And
Hmm.
if one more literary reference, since you were tolerant of the first one of my favorite writers, André Gide, advocated disponibilité à l'accueil. He advocated having a disposition towards welcoming life and what it has to offer. And so, if we want a pleasant life, how much is that actually about the conditions of life, and how much is it about the attitudes and behaviors that we bring to those conditions?
Oh, what a great question. I'm glad you mentioned burnout because that's kind of where my interest in happiness in the kind of emotional sense comes from. That I was very engaged in like existential struggle and doing meaningful and purposeful things and all that sort of stuff. And I essentially found myself burning out. Like that if there's not enough of an emotional payoff in terms of joy and enthusiasm and celebrating with friends and this kind of stuff, it's hard to maintain your motivation. It's hard to keep striving as hard as you are. So I then got much more interested in these kind of themes. In terms of whether they're about conditions or behavioral phenomena, I guess I'd lean more towards behavioral, but that's not to say that conditions don't matter. Of course, if we're not healthy, then very quickly our well-being falls off a cliff. So I think having your kind of basic material needs met, and for all of us, those what that means is going to have slightly different thresholds. There are some people who just have much stronger appreciation for comfort and things like that. I just think you need to be authentic about what kind of level of material security you need. But once you've got those things met, then I think it's more going to come down to behavioral phenomena. And there's a whole bunch of stuff here that we could talk about. The book goes into things like gratitude, which I think is probably the most important positive psychology practice. And that's part of a kind of wider constellation of stuff where you focus on the positive things in your life, what's going well, what's good, rather than focusing on the negative things. The book talks a lot about Epicureanism, which I think is a kind of misunderstood philosophy. So I think in the popular imagination, Epicurus is a hedonist and he's just out having orgies and drinking wine all the time. And that's really not the case. So Epicurus was all about kind of autonomy, I would say, and independence. So having enough capacity to kind of self-sufficiently produce your basic needs through a permaculture operation in your backyard, specifically in his case, that you could then engage in the things that really make your life joyful and fulfilling, which in his case was chatting with his mates and doing philosophy. And so for him, the idea is really that you can't have, and this is a literal quote from him, you can't have a wise and just life unless you have a pleasant life. And equally, you can't have a pleasant life unless you think about wisdom and justice. So I think that's kind of where the early themes of the book lie. And I do talk about some of the kind of common traps for young players around behavioral stuff as well.
Yeah, yeah, it reminds me of platonic love, which is the other one, which is misunderstood in the public imagination.
Hmm. Yeah.
But in terms of that wise and just life, you can't have a wise and just life without it being pleasant, and vice versa. Does
Mhm.
that mean that the bad guys aren't happy after all?
Wow, what a spicy question. I do actually have a lot of thoughts on this. I just don't know how technical to get with it. Um, Maybe let me just start with the kind of archetype that I think is very instructive in this regard. I do think that you could have a racist, like a hardcore kind of racist person who's well. That would depend heavily on everyone around him also being racist and validating this person's perspective and not being confronted by things that would challenge that sort of view. Um, I think they would need to have a bunch of other stuff going on as part of that architecture. But I generally don't think that you need to be moral in specific ways in order to be well. I do think, though, that unless you have aberrant psychology, like you're psychopathic or something like that, you do need to be concerned with value. in order to be well. So you need to be uh, under the impression that you're a good person, or at least you can't be going around with that challenged all the time. So I think a lot of people live fairly unconsciously about their values and the kind of values they're putting out into the world, and they surround themselves with other people who are also broadly unconscious and not really bothered by it. And I think you can be like pretty well in that circumstance, but you wouldn't be super healthy. Like the goal of positive psychology is not just to correct ill health, it's to try to get us to this kind of higher level of well-being. And I think for those kind of higher levels of well-being, you have to be engaged in a conscious way and an effortful way with trying to do good. But I don't think you need to be doing a particular conception of the good. You need to arrive authentically through some social and individual process at what you think is the good and be engaged in that with other people. And that's a huge theme of the book. So I think most of chapter 4 onwards, and then especially part 3 is all about that.
So we need to believe in what we're doing and have people who reinforce that belief around us to a degree. I want to get to the next section. There's so much to get through, but briefly, um, generally, what is the easier of the two levers to pull for having a more pleasant life? Putting something in our attitudes and behaviors or our conditions that isn't there currently, or taking something out that's not good that is there currently.
I usually think it's the latter for most people. There's a section in the book that I quite like called Self-Improvement by Negation, which is mostly about instead of thinking about how you can be better, how you can be more sexier, richer, running faster, whatever it might be. Think instead about the things that you know about yourself that just make you cringe, or that you find very uncomfortable, intolerable about yourself. And they're usually pretty easy to identify when you sit down and think about it, and put a bit more conscious effort into removing those things rather than adding something new. And I think in terms of pleasantness, that might be removing kind of our material desires. I have a research project where we interview people across the UK, long interviews, like an hour long, about what determines their satisfaction with life and how they report that on scales. And one thing that I've been really struck by is that the really wealthy people that we interview, who are often like venture capitalists and marketing executives and things like that, they often have quite high financial needs. They're aware that that makes them miserable, and they feel a bit kind of trapped by that. Like they can't really do anything about it. That's just the way they are. And sometimes they even know the psychological roots of it in like their childhood growing up in poverty and stuff like that. But they're just kind of stuck. And I think that's a situation where, as long as you're sort of sophisticated about it, you should be okay. But I think for a lot of people, it's just going to be things like knowing that you're tardy and you hate that about yourself. And then just putting some conscious effort into being punctual, or you know that you tend to like not clean as much as you should, or something, or that you have a habit of like getting a bit too fired up about politics in situations where you shouldn't, or something. There's a lot of memes about that. Like, don't be political. 3 beers later at the pub, you're like proselytizing, and you don't like that, and you know it makes other people uncomfortable. Just try to work on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Let's turn to phase two. Now that life is pleasant and our conversation is making that already the case. Now, you cite self-determination theory as part of the self-actualization process and the importance of achieving autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I think, from memory, Daniel Pink may have sort of popularized that slash ripped it off by changing it a little bit.
Right.
But what is that? Why are those three things so important, and how can we build them into ours and each other's lives?
I've got to check out Daniel Pink because I haven't come across that name before. So self-determination theory is one of the more prominent theories of motivation and well-being in social psychology, and it has a lot of clinical applications. And I've also seen a very large literature on it in organizational studies and behavior and organizational behavior. Um, and one thing that kind of sets it apart as a theory of well-being is that it's grounded in evolutionary dynamics, or at least they really try to think about what sort of organism a human is, what
Mm.
sort of things we would have evolved to need. It does build a bit on Maslow's hierarchy, which was never really a hierarchy, but it does think about needs quite a lot. And the idea is that while physical needs are really important, if our psychological needs are taken care of, we will probably take care of our physical needs. So, for example, the need to be autonomous is to have control over our lives rather than be controlled by other people. If I'm a slave, then there's much less likelihood that I'm going to be able to autonomously organize my life in a way that helps me flourish. So the idea is that these three things are universal needs that humans have in varying degrees. Some of us need a lot of friends, some of us just need one really close companion or something like that. But we need to be volitional in our life. We need to be competent at the skills that we perceive are necessary for our flourishing. And that's going to be different for different contexts and different times of history and different people. And then we need to have relatedness, which is a sense of being loved and cared for and having social support. And evolutionarily speaking, that was the number one determinant of whether you survived historically. A human by themselves in the jungle is dead very quickly. For humans, even if only one of them really knows how to fight, is an apex predator, very hard to handle. Um, so those are the three basic psychological needs. The reason why they are really important is, empirically speaking, we can see a very strong correlation between environments and behaviors that nourish these basic psychological needs and what we might call symptoms of well-being. So things like having vitality, enthusiasm for your life, a preponderance of positive affects. So things like joy and a sense of achievement, pride, that sort of stuff, rather than negative affects, sadness, fear, boredom, that sort of thing. And conversely, when these basic psychological needs are thwarted by, say, like domineering bosses, for example, then we tend to start to see more signs of ill-being and then in extreme cases, psychopathologies. So severe depressions, anxiety, that sort of stuff.
We're going to get on to how we make our lives more valuable, but I wonder if at this point it might be a good moment to touch on a particular contribution that I think that you've made to our understanding, which is through this idea of the coalescence of being and how we might expand our sense of self and how we determine ourselves beyond self-determination theory towards becoming the person we'd like to be.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So yeah, I would like to think this is my main contribution to this literature. So the coalescence of being is basically my model of self-actualization. Self-determination theory is a big part of it, but the basic building block is in self-discrepancy theory, which is basically positing that we have a sense of three aspects of ourselves. We have who we'd ideally like to be, who we are actually right now, and who we feel a sense of responsibility to be. We call that the ought self. And the process of self-actualization is an iterative process of trying to harmonize these three things. So we're trying to get our actual self closer to our ideal self without transgressing the ought self in some way. Um, and so if I take a simple example, but a very ambitious one. So say you want to be an astronaut, and it doesn't need to be ambitious. And I really stress that in the book. It's just easier to work with ambitious examples. So if you want to be an astronaut, you've got to think about, well, what kind of things define an astronaut? So they're really fit and they're really good at physics and chemistry and this sort of stuff. So that's a place to start. I've got to go enroll in a gymnastics club. I've got to go learn some physics. So these high level goals that we have inform lower level goals and inform preferences all the way through to our consumption behavior, what gym memberships I buy, what protein powders I buy, this kind of stuff. Once I start engaging in these behaviors, I'm going to get feedback. And I think that's one of the key things. So we're going to get social feedback from the people in those groups. And even more importantly, I think we're going to get emotional and affective feedback. And the most important kind of affective feedback, in my opinion, is motivational feedback. So it's really simple to observe when you're doing something that you're enjoying it. That's a signal that you should double down on it. Motivational signals can be a bit more complicated. So in self-determination, we have this spectrum of motivation running from extrinsic at one end to intrinsic on the other. Extrinsic is things you do under duress. Intrinsic is things that you do kind of spontaneously and automatically. They just arise out of you. So our hobbies are usually intrinsically motivated. You don't need any kind of push to get you to do them. The really interesting forms of motivation are in the middle for me. There's introjected motivation, which is where you're doing a thing for something that's not inherent to that thing itself. You value something that it's contingent on. So, for example, a lot of us want to be healthy, but we don't necessarily like exercise. Um, So you're doing the exercise, but you don't enjoy the exercise. You've got no intrinsic motivation for it. You don't even really value the exercise. You just value health. Now, when you succeed in doing something that has introjected motivation, it's going to have quite nuanced forms of motivational feedback that you get. So you'll usually have a sense of achievement, but more like a sense of like relief. Like, oh, I managed to get through my gym session this week again. Like, well done. I'll go give myself a treat or something, pat on the back kind of stuff. And I think it's really important to pay attention to what happens when you get the thing that your activity is contingent on. So, like, if we don't like exercise, but we're trying to get aesthetic or we're trying to lose weight or something like that, then when you observe yourself in the mirror and you're like, oh, I really have lost some weight, or I really do like the way my pecs look or something. If the feedback is there and it's positive, then you can sustain that motivation for the gym. But if when you get the thing that is contingent on the activity, you still don't really have much of a positive payoff, then this is a sign that this value is really inauthentic to you. You've probably internalized it from society or from your parents or something like that. And you want to have a deep think about whether this thing is right for you. The next level of motivation that goes along is identified motivation. That's where we do value the thing itself. And here, the key signal, I think, that it's an identified value is the sense of achievement and the kind of warm and fuzzies that you get when you complete this activity. It's often because you're valuing it, it's probably related to your ought self in some way. It's probably kind of morally or ethically laden. And so when you do it, you think, oh, I've done the right thing, like good on me. But if you don't get that warm feeling, again, you've probably just internalized this from somewhere else. It's not like really a value that you hold authentically. And so I think these kind of motivational signals and other emotional signals, you have to learn to introspect on them, to decode what they're telling you. And I do talk a bit about that in the book. And once you have decoded it, then you can make changes to your ideal self concept, your ought self concept, and sometimes to your actual self. Like maybe you realize that you've changed over time and you're aware of how you've changed. And now you recalibrate and you keep going with this process. And so gradually we have a combined process of discovery and creation, and we slowly arrive at the kind of person that we feel proud to be, that we're motivated to be every day. And generally we're getting more positive feedback from our life, and that's signaling to us that we've organized it in a good way because we've got those pleasant, fulfilling, and valuable experiences coming thick and fast.
Yeah, I particularly like this idea of the coalescence of being, and I also really enjoy how it sort of seems to replicate psychologically a lot of our biological processes of adaptation. But for a moment, I want to be a recalcitrant disciple. And
Hmm.
there are some challenges on the coalescence.
Hmm.
So I don't think I can coalesce my being. And my excuses are our capacity for introspection is limited.
Hmm.
We don't have perfect information, so we can't necessarily try out all of the things that we would need to try out to find our perfect fit.
Hmm.
In today's world, the commitment threshold for trying something out is often too high.
Hmm.
I mean, you go on a first date with somebody before you get married, but taking on a job is a bit like getting married as the first date. It's quite
Hmm.
a high bar. There are so many ratchet effects in our lives where the way that we've learned to be, there is so much that just pushes us to continue being that way
Hmm.
rather than to change. And so much in our lives, every part of it depends on everything else. If you have caring responsibilities, it's quite hard to play fast and loose in trying out a different job, for
Hmm.
example. So, what would you say to this disciple with a bad attitude?
Hmm. I think these are great provocations. Let me talk first about, I suppose the way I'd frame it is the limited capabilities that we have. So this starts to bleed a bit more into the well-being state kind of idea that post World War II, the main thing we've focused on in terms of expanding the options that are available to people in their lives is by ensuring that people have health and income,
Mm,
to a lesser extent, education or a very particular kind of education. So we have invested heavily in education, but education for work, not for life
mm,
necessarily. We also worked a lot on hygiene and we worked a lot on employment, so making jobs available. And I think the welfare state has broadly succeeded in those endeavors across the OECD, at least relative to the situation before the advent of the welfare state. I think now we need to push into a kind of more multidimensional way of conceptualizing the options that are available for people. So I think education is getting longer, and that's kind of unavoidable. And as part of it getting longer, we need to incorporate more preparation for life, not just work. So that would involve teaching people about emotional literacy so they can have better interpersonal relationships and so they can understand themselves better.
Yeah.
It would involve exposing people to a wider range of activities, a wider range of things that they might want to do with their life, and encouraging them to think about what's good in their life as things that meet their authentic desires, their authentic needs, promote the good, this kind of stuff, not just what's going to make you heaps of money or help you afford an apartment in Mayfair or something like that. Um, in terms of limited introspection, I agree, but I do think this is a cultivatable skill and something that can be trained. And this is a very long-running theme in Aristotelian perspectives on well-being that you have to help people acquire practical wisdom, and that's hard, and it takes a while. I think we have pretty good popular books on this now, but again, I think this is something that could be incorporated into education in a more robust and thorough manner. Um, the commitment thresholds idea, fascinating. I do feel like I'm going to get anecdotal, but I teach in a UK university, and I'm really struck by the speed with which my students just get into the workforce and get into those sort of path dependencies that you described as ratchet effects. Um, I think part of it is that we load them up with debt, and I'm pretty fond of income contingent loans. So I think the alternatives are complicated. I don't want to say that the debt is a terrible idea. But the students often don't take any time to travel, don't take much time, I think, to really sample different workplaces. And they don't go into the choices that they do make with a conscious awareness that they're just testing this out. I think oftentimes they're going into things because they've been told that that's prestigious, that that's an indicator of success, and they don't really know what success means for them personally or what it would mean for them personally to find a job that fits them. They just kind of follow the laid out paths. And that can often work out for most people. I don't want to particularly critique it. These are hard information problems to solve. But I think we can do more to help people be conscious about those kind of decisions. And that way, if you do a 2 or 3 year grad program and you're like, you know what, this probably wasn't the thing for me, but I've got good skills, you will be aware why it's not a good thing for you, and you'll be more ready to switch to something else. And then the last point you made, which I'm really thinking a lot about at the moment, what I would call like contingencies, that everything in your life is contingent on other things. Again, in this research we're doing with people and their life satisfaction, we often get people say things like, oh, I'm pretty happy here. I live kind of in a village with my husband, and he's doing well, and we have a good relationship, and we like the people here. But one thing that's kind of missing from my life is that I'm mostly working in an accounting operation. I'd want to be working more in conservation or something like that. And I could do more conservation work in Scotland because there's just more of it there. But then we'd have to sell the house, which would be difficult, and my husband's job would. And so they're like aware of all these contingencies and they're trying to optimize within them. And I think that might just like, that's just life. We try our best. I'm not even sure that if we had a well-being state, we could necessarily surmount a lot of those contingencies. But I hope that again, people are making these decisions consciously,
Yeah.
not just falling into it.
Yeah. So let's turn to making our lives valuable. I will become a good disciple again, I promise. I remember coming across some research that came out of the Harvard Divinity School a few years ago, and it got reduced to it was research into the characteristics of successful religions. And they boiled it down to three B's. A successful religion brings a sense of belonging, it brings a sense of becoming, and it brings a sense of beyond. Now, I think with your help as a disciple, I can get to belonging and becoming. Um, in terms of that sense of beyond, though,
Hmm.
fewer and fewer people have the comfort of religion.
Hmm.
Um, I'm old enough that when I was at school and even university, there was a sense of progress and that tomorrow was almost certainly going to be better than yesterday and so on. But our sense of global progress and our sense that the world is going in a positive direction are becoming increasingly fragile.
Hmm.
Even our sense of security or the illusion of security that we've lived with feels like, that illusion is fading. How can we have a healthy story of the value of our lives if we don't have a healthy story of where the world is going. How do we overcome that kind of real deep concern?
Oh, it's a big question. I think I can handle it. Let me first emphasize that I think the beyond point is mostly about something beyond yourself. So I think achieving our individual dreams for most of us ends up with us feeling a little bit hollow. Like we need to be feel like we are contributing to something beyond us. I don't necessarily think we need to have transcendental ends. So what religion provides in many cases is something teleological, like as you described, this kind of progress towards some divine end. I'm skeptical of all kind of teleological claims, but I'm not skeptical that humans can feel like they are contributing to a greater good and that that is significant to our lives. The book's fairly agnostic on a lot of these issues, so I'd like to think that it's not overly critical of religion, but a lot of part three is motivated by like a secular view of how we can think of ourselves as moral agents and people who create value and this sort of stuff. The point about where the world is going is a kind of major theme of chapters 8 and 9. So, chapter 7 kind of sets up the problem of nihilism, the sense that life is meaningless, the sense that our values are kind of made up, like that they lack binding power over us, um, and the sense that the world is incoherent, like that it doesn't sort of make sense in a meaningful way. I don't mean in a rational way. I mean, in what is the meaning of the world? Chapter 8 then provides a solution to that at the individual level, I think, which is kind of basically just taking the coalescence of being in a more moral direction. And then starts to say that the problem with that, or the challenge for that, is that anytime you're trying to live a values-led life, it's very hard to do that unless other people are around you celebrating the same values that you're celebrating. Now, historically, we did that through tradition, cultures, this kind of thing, but those cultures were a bit oppressive. So we tended to socialize people into them from birth, which I think goes back to your unruly disciple point about these ratchet effects and getting people tunneled into non-autonomous ways of being. Um, and generally, if your nature was incompatible with that prevailing culture, then you ended up in a really bad spot. And I think over the course of the late 20th century, so the postmodern period, we really started to critique a lot of those kind of things. So we deconstructed the notion that there's like sort of moral truth embedded in the firmament. Foucault had all these critiques of expertise, and that a lot of claims about knowledge were actually just people's value judgments, like that, homosexuality is an illness. That was just a value judgment of the kind of Christian bourgeoisie. And then we also had Lyotard coming out and expressing this idea that was in the zeitgeist, this kind of skepticism towards meta narratives. So nationalism, communism, capitalism, whatever it might be, everyone became a bit skeptical of these kind of grand organizing stories. And I think that was necessary to get rid of this oppression, but it did land us in this kind of nihilistic swamp. Like it's very hard to get even your own values going, let alone values with other people. And so I do think we end up then with the kind of the I culture of, well, I'm going to succeed in what I care about. And everyone starts to be really obsessed with their material success, their commercial success, their career success, and things like getting really jacked and beating their personal bests and that sort of stuff. And we kind of lose sight of community organization, little platoons, things that we do together. And so chapter 9 then is about how to rescue meaning and value and collective endeavor from this kind of swamp. And the answer that I present there is metamodernity, which is a kind of fusion of modernist sentiment. So there's sentiment that if we apply reason and humanistic values, we can make a better world, and postmodern cynicism to kind of big overarching claims about what that better world looks like. And so the idea is that you just need to be really sincere and earnest about your values. So you just put them out into the world and say, I'm going to be over here doing whatever it might be, permaculture in my backyard. If you also care about permaculture, then come join me here in this space and let's create a community of people who also care about these sorts of things. And those communities are policed much less intensively than, say, old church communities used to be policed. Their borders are much more porous, but you can still get engaged in the kind of artistic, cultural, emotive celebration of values that we need to feel like our lives are meaningful. We're contributing to something that is beyond
Yeah,
our individual.
yeah, yeah. I think the notion of metamodernity is something for us somehow to all dive into at some point, I think. When I spoke about my first book, I frequently invited people to think about how they might seek to make their stakeholders' lives easier, more complete, or more, in some way, more magical. And in a sense, that phrase came back to me this afternoon because, in a sense, that could correspond to the three parts of your book. An
Mm,
easier life is a more enjoyable, pleasant life. A more
mm,
complete life is more fulfilling, and maybe there is value to bringing magic back, particularly in difficult times. And in difficult times, people often still like to go to the theatre or something like that. And I
mhm,
think it's because we yearn for that sense of magic. But let's park the magic for a moment because you said at the end of your book that trying to think comprehensively about well-being is a bit like trying to carry leaves in your arms. Now, if we think in the workplace, most managers and leaders do not have the time that you have to focus on well-being. So let's say you run a business promoting, you developed organic protein powder and you really believe in organic protein powder and you want to do it. How do you ensure your stakeholders' well-being, or how do you relate it to that? Or similarly, if you're a charity working on a tough issue, let's say you're a charity working on financial hardship. Now, you'd
mhm,
think that for people who are really up against it financially and supporting them,
mhm,
ideas of mid maternity, you have to put what is the practical replicable approach that you could do in your choice of either of those contexts, a charity working on financial hardship, for example,
mhm.
or organic protein powder.
So I want to stress that I'm not like a business organizations person, but I am synthesizing ideas that I get, especially from colleagues of mine like Will Fleming. Um, so one of the main findings of Will's research is that a lot of the stuff that's conventionally done in organizations to promote well-being, like lunchtime yoga and this kind of stuff, basically doesn't work. And that the main thing that promotes well-being of stakeholders, especially employees, is autonomy and collaboration, as opposed to a kind of very managerial way of doing things. So by managerial, I mean like really top-down command and control. Managers are looking at spreadsheets. It's very kind of Taylorism. I don't know if that means things to you guys, but so Taylor, famously went down into the shop floor of a manufacturing place, asked the kind of biggest, burliest dudes there how many blocks they could stack in 10 minutes or whatever, offered them bonuses for that, timed them, and then once he'd figured that out, he then kind of made that the baseline level of expectation. That's a really quick way to ruin the autonomy of your workers, make them lose pride in their competence because it's now being used against them, and generally make them feel not loved nor cared for, and so ruin their relatedness as well. So I think you're basically going to tank your workers' well-being, and the kind of financial compensation that you offer them in that case is just likely to create extrinsic motivation. And so this is a mess, and it's not a good way forward. But I think in the contemporary scientific publishing landscape, the kind of stuff where you have a very distinct intervention like lunchtime yoga, and then we can measure that with a randomized control trial. This sort of stuff is very publishable at the moment, and so I think we're getting much more of this kind of stuff getting pushed out into the popular domain, rather than messier, more complex, harder to observe, harder to evaluate rigorously, qualitative type stuff. I'm doing a lot of that kind of qualitative type stuff, and so I want to stress that I don't have the best evidence for it working, other than the organizations that do it seem to report really good outcomes. And the main thing that I talk about here is what's sometimes called co-production or co-design or just like collaborative management, but basically getting everyone into a room in a relatively flat kind of space, so not hierarchical. You'll need managers, you'll need people who are steering and organizing and this kind of thing, but their job is to facilitate the deliberation, not to um, tell people what to do. And in that space, so in the policy work that we do, we're bringing together people who have technical expertise over an issue, practitioners who are going to be implementing whatever it is that we come up with, and then people with lived experience or the people who are going to be affected by whatever it is that we come up with. And we mostly center their values, and then we try to figure out using the practitioners how it is that we could get that done. And then the technical experts often will offer insights into how we might measure that, how we might evaluate it, kind of pulling in things that we've learned from other case studies, that sort of stuff. So that would be my main suggestion is to think about how you can foster the basic psychological needs of your staff. And one of the main ways to do that is this kind of collaborative stuff where people feel they have autonomy or at least voice, feel that they can use their skills in a way that's constructive for everybody around them, and they feel supported, I should say, and that's going to nourish their relatedness.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And of course, when we're thinking about customers, I guess the sort of biological well-being dimension is quite important too. I mean, the amount of the food industry that is
Mm,
ultra-processed food and so on. So I suppose asking ourselves if something that we're offering is genuinely in people's best interests is it doesn't sound complicated and it doesn't require expensive studies to expensive market research
mm.
commissioning. It does feel like an important step.
That's
Let
something, can I just say something very quickly on that? So it's like a point that I love making. Not all of us can like create peace in the Middle East, or or even organic protein powder or whatever it might be. There are so many products that we produce that seem very mundane, ethically speaking, on the surface of it, but are very important to people. Like biscuits generate huge amounts of value for people. Good tea, a dishwasher that works, whatever it might be. If you're involved in one of those kind of products, just think about the stuff you just mentioned. How can I make my employees have a better time at work? Let's think about our supply chains and cleaning them up. Let's think about the kind of wider social contribution that we're making and take that kind of values-led approach into what you're doing. And I talk a bit about B Corps as an entry point into this in the book, that just getting beyond shareholder value will already facilitate a lot of this kind of stuff.
So, a quick reminder to people that you can start putting your thinking caps on for your questions, and you can even start to raise your hand so that I know that you're ready. But I want to go a little bit macro for a moment. I think it was fairly widely reported in well-being circles anyway that Sir Keir Starmer said that he would expect a Labour government to evaluate every investment decision through the lens of well-being as well as through the lens of GDP. I don't know what your assessment is of how well he's getting on with that so far, but we do have problems with the welfare state. The welfare reform bill tanked a few days ago. Welfare and public spending more broadly is rising, and we don't want less of it, but we're not necessarily keen to pay for it. Um, what kind of alternatives might you want to advise if Keir is listening?
Let's have fingers crossed. Um, so So I think there's a broad awareness in many communities that the way we currently do public policy, do governance, our kind of political economic system is a bit played out. So it's contributing to environmental crises, we have mental health epidemics, we have all sorts of other problems. In the well-being space, there's a few strands of advocacy on this. We have like the degrowth movement, we have the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and these kind of advocates. We have people like Richard Layard at the LSE advocating for what Keir Starmer talked about, so using life satisfaction data, especially to measure the outcomes of policies. I think all of that's like broadly good. Like there's a lot of ideas in all of that stuff. What's missing, in my opinion, is that the welfare state required an enormous transformation in public administration and management. So the way paperwork is done, the way contracts are written, this sort of stuff. Similarly, neoliberalism went hand in hand with an enormous transformation in the way governance was done. So the day-to-day operations of the government. And I think a lot of this advocacy at the moment for a new way of doing things doesn't engage at all with the administration and management. And it seems to me that unfortunately, most of the barriers to these transformations are in the administration. In the UK in particular, and I think Keir Starmer's statement really speaks to this, the major challenge is the way government does procurement, evaluation, commissioning of services, which is to think about outcomes that we can measure very clearly. And then we write contracts for typically private sector providers of those services, and we hold them legally accountable on that basis. In many ways, that works really well. So in the early days of neoliberalism, we did garbage collection newly under this way of doing things, a revolution in garbage collection, so much better. But most of the things that are breaking down today, like social care, education, mental health, these are all areas where the outcomes are very hard to measure. they're usually multidimensional and they're emergent. So you need a complex policy system to give rise to this stuff, not just one policy. So you can't really evaluate that one policy on a clear set of metrics. And so the whole architecture of cost benefit analysis and randomized control trials as a way of thinking about how we get ahead with this stuff is kind of wrong-headed. And we need new ways of thinking about policy organization. So I don't think Keir Starmer's quite grabbed the core issue in saying that we need to use well-being. So that's part of it. But I think what we actually need is to embrace a bunch of other ideas that I'm going to talk about in the book, and I can talk about now if you want. So the relational state,
Mm.
doing things much more democratically and sociologically as a form of accountability. So just having people involved in these co-production mechanisms creates accountability without the need for quite as much metrics and legal architecture, using auditing rather than legal architecture when we do need something a bit more formal. Um, Participatory governance, that relates to the co-production kind of aspect. Um, Having mission-driven bureaucrats, so people who are involved in service delivery because they care about it, not because they're out to make a buck. And there are people like that, and we have learned a lot about organizational culture and organizational psychology, so we can spot them more easily than we could in the 80s and bring them into the system. And there's a few other ideas that I could talk about, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, no, they are fascinating ideas, and we'll see if we get a chance to squeeze them in. And they also seem resonant with the exchange we had with Andy Burnham.
Yeah,
Of
absolutely.
course,
Yeah.
Miranda, who seems to be, if I try to think of a politician who embodies and lives up to the kind of story you're telling, then Andy comes to mind pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But I want to go to people's questions as they arise. I have plenty more for you as well.
Hi, thank you so much. Really fascinating. And aligns with a lot of my thinking on, I guess, the brief. What is the brief for creating the culture? Kind of what are our, I guess, our success criteria? I wanted to ask. It's like from the Happiness Cure, Dr. Anders Hansen. He spoke about the fact that we need to be a bit fair on ourselves because we're not designed to live in the world that we've actually created, and our bodies just aren't programmed for this.
Mm.
So this whole concept of the fact that happiness is something we should be all the time
Mhm.
is, in his mind, our bodies don't know how to do that, and it's not a natural state for us to be.
Mhm.
So that was one thought, and then I guess going back to that genetic programming. We are tribe people. We like living in communities, and those are things that society has kind of taken away from us. Do you feel that more community based, if we understand what it is that we need to feel happy, and that's feeling part of the tribe, feeling part of the community? Obviously, it's been manipulated to being having the bigger house, having the most likes on TikTok, all of these kind of things.
Mhm.
But it's that fundamental part that we want to be accepted and included.
Mhm.
So I just kind of, wanted to kind of understand your thinking, I guess, on that. I guess we're really trying to say is how do we kind of meet the requirements of our genetic programming in
Mhm.
order to create a better world for ourselves?
I'm very sympathetic to everything you just said, and I certainly think that we need to practice a lot of self-compassion and also that the current environments that we've set up are not especially conducive to our well-being. I do think that some of the more kind of extreme aspects of neoliberal capitalism are quite pernicious to our well-being. And one thing that I would lean on here just as an illustrative example is that the economics of agglomerating in cities, like of metropolises, is impeccable. So you can totally see why everything is driven in that direction over the last 20 or 30 years. But the kind of sociology, anthropology, the well-being of agglomerating in metropolises, at least the form that our current metropolises take, is not very good. In particular, because as you said, it's actually surprisingly difficult for people to form connections and form communities in modern environments, mostly because I would say of the commute. So even in a kind of broadly inner London where I live, which is they've done a pretty good job with the cycleways and that sort of thing. Friends of mine who I feel like live a couple of suburbs over, it takes me an hour to get there. And so the capacity to just kind of call someone up and be like, hey, do you want to grab a beer? Is really hampered by that. It kind of reduces the ability of us to kind of spontaneously get together with people. Environments often need to be traversed that are insecure, unsafe in various ways, just like there's a lot of cars or something like that. Um, Compare that to something like a residential college at a university, which so I spent 5 years at a residential college in various kind of leadership positions and stuff like that. And I still think of that as the sort of platonic form of a functional environment. It's not something that you can really raise kids in, so it needs to expand in some ways to facilitate that. But the key thing about those kind of colleges is that people have private space where they can do whatever it is that they might want to do. Um, but they also have communal areas where they can get together, and you tend to end up looking out for people just because they're familiar to you. It's not because you have shared values. You might not even like them, generally speaking, but you live with them, so you have to deal with their stuff. And so you try to heal people, you try to rehabilitate them into the community. You try to help them deal with whatever issues they might have, and that creates a much more functional environment. You can provide a lot more collective goods that people then use on a shared basis without really needing like a complex sharing architecture. And so I think getting our urban forms, especially somewhat closer to that through things like 15-minute cities, through things like solar punk design, like having more urban gardens and that sort of stuff, I think is a really big part of making the forms of social organization that we have more compatible with well-being. And I think the other part of that would be the B Corps that I mentioned. So having workplaces that are a bit more multidimensional in what they're trying to achieve.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much indeed for your perspectives, and thanks, Paul. I was smiling there because agency over jobs is, in fact, what I have now, and I didn't have for a long time. And my question, Mark, is about the aging population. Over 20% of adults in the country is now over 65, and I
Mhm.
wondered whether or not you'd measured well-being feelings in that community. And indeed, there's a more important question for me, and that is whether that community, in terms of its well-being, has an impact on the overarching feeling of well-being and um, and uh, acceptance, if you like, in the country at large. Are they an important contributor to how we all feel? Thanks. Thanks,
Yeah,
Paul.
great question. Let me start with some stuff that is relatively more scientific, and then I'll give something that's one of my like strongly held opinions, but it's very much an opinion. So in terms of the well-being of the elderly, one of the most robust results in life satisfaction science is this kind of U shape in life satisfaction over the life course. It's a very average thing, so we're aggregating millions of people. But generally speaking, life satisfaction tends to decline a bit through 30, 40, 50 years old, and then picks up again after retirement, and then really goes off a bit of a cliff once people get to sort of 80, 85. And that's mostly driven by health deteriorating rapidly and people's friends dying.
Right.
Um, so the elderly tend to be among the happiest, or at least the kind of retired segment of the population is among the happiest. And I think that's a really big success of the kind of improvements in health over the course of the 20th century, that we now have like 20 years of being able to enjoy that rather than two, like what people had for most of the 20th century, if they ever got to retire. Um, the Nonetheless, there are like substantial pockets among the elderly where well-being is quite bad, and the main driver of that seems to be loneliness, and also a general perception of kind of social exclusion, that the elderly aren't respected, that they aren't integrated in some kind of useful way. I'm increasingly fond of some kind of return to three generation households. Mostly, I came at that from the housing crisis, and that there are a lot of sort of family-sized homes that are occupied by retirees, and we need to just kind of get everyone back together in some way. I think we were too enthusiastic in farming out elderly care to the welfare state, and we need to kind of bring that to some extent back into households, and try to find some way to kind of rewrite the social contract on that. Um, I think that is what gets me into your second question about the impact of the elderly on the broader sentiment around the country. I think one thing that's really it's kind of complicated to lay this out, but elderly people tend to live separately from young people. So younger people are typically in the metropolises because that's where the jobs are. Um, they are trying to make enough money to move out into the places where the elderly people are, the suburbs, villages that Dorina talked about, these kind of places. You can't really move out there until you retire because you'll be too far away from the place you're working. Remote work has facilitated a bit more of that. Simultaneously, I think we have a situation where, and this is now definitely my opinion, there are a lot of policy changes that we need to make that are really kind of radical. And so I think some elderly people are a bit confronted by that. If you look at the voting demographics, the Conservative parties always draw overwhelmingly their votes from older people who are happy with the way things are. Um, if you're in a situation where the way things are, as we've been discussing, is a bit bad for people, particularly for working age people, then having that kind of intransigence among the elderly population, I think creates animosity between generations. And we definitely have that as a phenomenon at the moment. There's a book by a colleague of mine, Kevin Munger, which is about the US called actually, it's not called boomer ballast, but that's the word that he talks about a lot. But I'll try to generation gap is what the book's called. But it's basically exploring a lot of these kind of phenomena through the lens of voting and the kind of policies that are endorsed by different groups. And I think the particular touchstone for this is the housing crisis, and the inability of governments to build housing where people want it. And I think there is an intergenerational problem there.
Mm. Okay. Thanks. We could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, definitely.
Many of those things, they certainly resonate with me, and indeed many of the people that I work with.
Right, great, yeah.
So thanks. That's really
No worries. I might just say I'm trying to, in the wellbeing economy movement, there is a lot of discussion about having national conversations around what it means for life to go well and what it would mean for a society to be functional. And I think a crucial part of that is getting more demographic and geographic mixing. And I am trying to facilitate a project in this regard at the moment, but it's tricky.
You might be interested in a market or consumer research community, which is called COALESCE, which is run by Newcastle University,
Oh, yeah.
the National Innovation Centre for Aging, and that could get you many insights in a variety of different parts of the elderly community.
Mhm.
And by the way, the multi-agency issues that exist for multi-generations
Mm.
are enormous. I mean, housing people very rarely talk to caring people.
Yeah.
People very rarely talk to younger people about these issues. Public sector people rarely talk to private sector people about these issues.
Mhm.
It's a very tough ask to deal with some of these intransigent problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy.
Reminds me a bit of one of Andy Burnham's comments in our exchange with him, something of relevant to the well-being state and the current problem with the welfare reform bill. He talked about the long-term people who are out of work long-term, for example, with mental health issues.
Mhm.
He was very much in favour of schemes they were trialling in Manchester, where just at the point where somebody is no longer short-term and bordering on becoming long-term unemployed, they get help in collaboration from the NHS, they get medical support,
Mhm.
they also get support from the Department of Work and Pensions to be encouraged to find pathways into work, and it all comes
Mhm.
together at just the right time, at a
Mhm.
sort of acupuncture point or a critical moment that helps people not get into a place from which it is very, very hard to recover. But I want to just ask a final question, because what you've just said about a national conversation aligns with it, and
Mhm.
raises this question. I've recently been suggesting that just as we had the Industrial Revolution that increased prosperity but had the shadow of carbon emissions and created climate change, our digital revolution has created so much connectivity, but at the expense of harming so much of our
Mhm.
public conversation with misinformation, polarization, abuse, and that's created conditions in which it's hard for common sense and uh,
Mhm.
open and sincere conversations where evidence and reason is used to escalate upwards and find common ground. And I know this is something that Diane Coyle from your
Hmm.
Bennett Institute has written about, because I came across that in my prep for the exchange with Will Hutton earlier in the
All
year.
right.
He
Okay.
cites that work, and I've been reading her FT articles on how
Hmm.
academics and researchers now need perhaps to go over the heads of politicians and other
Hmm.
leaders, because unless they have public support for their ideas, reason and evidence alone isn't enough to convince a business leader or a politician to do something.
Hmm.
So I just wonder, what's your sort of theory of change for making your good ideas on the well-being state actually take hold, and is this national conversation part of it?
The national conversation is part of it, but I think the succinct answer to your question of what's my theory of change is definitely to try to go viral, not top down. I do think the internet can facilitate that. But the main thing, coming back to the point about the British manner of public management being obsessed with metrics, is that for the well-being state to get going, we need a generalizable process, not a generalizable collection of metrics. So it's not about this is how you measure well-being, go out and figure out what improves these measures in your community. It's about having, here's a very simple toolkit that anyone can get off the shelf for free to apply in their context. Might be an organization, might be a village, neighborhood, whatever it might be. And you can use that to kind of co-produce what well-being means in this context. That's going to be really different for different contexts. So in a village, it's going to mean one thing. In social care, it's going to mean one thing. In the military services, it's going to mean a different thing. In a prison, it's going to mean a different thing. There will be common tropes across all of those, but the way that you make it practical to your context is going to emerge from you doing it there locally. And then you'll, on the basis of having that understanding, be able to figure out, again, co-productively, what is going to improve it. And only then do you think about how you might try to measure that. Or even, I would say, how you try to evaluate it, which might just involve observation, not measurement. How you're going to capture all those observations that people have, discuss them, distill the wisdom that you can get from those observations. Hopefully, measurement is in there somewhere. But once you have this process and anyone's doing it, then you can get this viral change. So it works somewhere, and then those people go and tell other people about how it worked for them. Why don't you try it? It's here, it's free. Just take it off the shelf. And I think that's how the donut economics stuff has been working. So I didn't find Kate Raworth's book all that amazing, if I'm being honest with you. But the donut economics toolkit that came later, once there was such a like groundswell of enthusiasm for it, that really does seem to have been leading to a lot of transformative change in all sorts of communities and organizations that are just taking the tools that are there on that website and applying them in their local context. So I think we need to come up with stuff like that for well-being, and then communities can basically bypass the politicians and just get it done locally. And I think that will create the kind of democratic energy, the kind of case studies, proofs of concept, that sort of thing that would then lead to more pressure on politicians, larger businesses, larger organizations, that sort of thing, to do things differently.
Yeah,
Hopefully, hopefully. I
that
don't know.
sounds exciting to me. The future will not be specified; it will be worked out
Yeah.
case by case. You have the economic assumption, ceteris paribus, all things being equal.
Mm,
Of course, in reality, all things are never equal.
mm,
You can't swap. You wouldn't want to swap a child with another child. The narrative arc is incredibly important, and you can think of marketing as a department in an organization. You can also think of it as a narrative-based discipline alongside other narrative-based disciplines. And I think a narrative-based approach to working out what kind of a future we want to aspire to is an incredibly important and timely thing to be working on. A couple of quick notices actually at this point to make sure I don't forget. But we have Your Marketing Kind with Victoria Harvey on why we should ban fossil fuel ads on July 23rd. She came to us through Mike Berners-Lee, who is one of the few people who's done two exchanges with us. And we have our next exchange. We won't have an exchange in August. So our next exchange will be in September 4th, and it will be with Paolo Titiki and Melina Corvalia Shari, co-authors of the book How to Be Sustainable. And Mark, thank you so much for your book, your contribution to our well-being, your willingness to embrace even a recalcitrant disciple in this exchange. And actually, I mentioned there's only a couple of people who've done more than one exchange with us, but
Mm.
we love your work so much. We would love to do some kind of launch event with you when the well-being state is published.
I would be
And
very grateful.
en route to that, if you'd like to do one of your Marketing Kind sessions on your choice, either of the idea of the well-being state as you're working on it, or on the national conversation that you've just introduced,
Mm.
we
Okay.
would love to have a conversation with that.
Great. That sounds really exciting. Can I make a book recommendation for you guys? So Hilary Cottam's just got her new book out, The Work We Need, and it sounds like the kind of thing that you would be very interested in, particularly because you're more focused on organizations, and that's a lot of what she's talking about. And I do talk about her a bit in Beyond
Mm.
Happy, and I think she's just generally she's a bit of like a personal hero of mine. She just kind of always goes to where the world is darkest, and just kind of hangs out there. Like her level of resilience is kind of awe-inspiring to me. And she always comes out with really like effective ways to deal with some of the hardest stuff. And so I think now that she's pivoted to work, I think she has a lot of interesting ideas there.
That sounds like a great book to read. And if she'd like to do one of our exchanges, we would, you don't have to say to this, but we'd
Sure.
love to invite you to host.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd be
So
happy to do
that,
that.
that conversation could be a really enlivening one.
Mhm. Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. It was really a lot of fun.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for
Cheers.
coming.
Thanks,
See you.
everyone.